Greetings to everyone with us. On behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you to the first lecture of the John Paul II Lectures this academic year. The series organized by the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is part of our Faculty of Philosophy here at the Angelicum in Rome. This lecture, as well as the entire JP2 Lectures series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities, Father Thomas Joseph White, Director of Angelicum, and Father Serge Thomas Bonino, the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, whom I would like to thank. Special thanks are also in order for the founders of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, donors and supporters of St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, our audience, and all viewers in front of the screens. We are glad to be finally able to meet you in person. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the life and thought of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II is embodied in the JP2 Lectures, which are monthly lectures of eminent interdisciplinary academics who will revisit the extraordinary contribution on John Paul II for our own day. Last academic year, we had the honor of hosting such prominent academics as Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, Professor John Finnis, Archbishop Rowan Williams, Professor Marek Cichocki, Professor John Cavadini, Frater François Daguet, Professor Chantal Dassault, Professor Remy Braque, Professor Renato Christin, and Professor Dariusz Gawin. Now, I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Dariusz Karłowicz, the initiator of the JP2 Lectures, serious philosopher, editor-in-chief of the Polish Early Political Theology, and president of St. Nicholas Foundation, strategic partner of the Institute. Dariusz Karłowicz will share more about our today's special guest.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm honored to introduce to you John Lord Alderdice, Senior Research Fellow of Harris Manchester College and the first Chairman of a Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts, which he earlier founded. In 1996, he was appointed a life member of the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber of the British Parliament. In the 30 years, Lord Alderdice has been involved in almost every aspect of the Irish peace process. From October 1987, for 11 years, he was leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland and was a key negotiator of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Lord Alderdice's professional background is a clinical and academic physician and psychiatrist. In his speech, Lord Alderdice will look at the contradictory views on religion that emerge in contemporary public debate. Religion is regularly blamed by its opponents for being a source of unrest and even violent conflict. And they are able to point to many instances, the past and present, where this appears to be the case. Adherents claim that, on the contrary, the religion is a source of peace at a personal level, as well as more widely in society. These challenging topics will be addressed by Lord Alderdice from the perspective of psychology, politics, and faith, all fields in which he had a long-standing involvement and commitment. John, floor is yours.
Rector, Ambassador, Father Cesare, thank you very much for the kind welcome. And thank you also very much to Darius and to Joanna for their kind invitation to come and give this lecture. And I can't but also thank Marta, who has been sending emails backwards and forwards and helping enormously to make sure that I got here safely. So thank you very much indeed. The 7th of November this year will see the first anniversary of the death of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, a distinguished Jewish theologian, philosopher, author, and public intellectual. He was a colleague of mine in the British House of Lords, and many of us still mourn his passing and miss his important contributions. Referring to people of faith, he expressed the view that together we are called to heal a fractured world. However, as he also noted, the fact that the great universal monotheisms have not yet formally endorsed a plural world is still the unexorcised darkness at the heart of our religious situation. However, Rabbi Sacks himself ran into problems within his own Jewish community when, in the first edition of his book, The Dignity of Difference, published in August 2002 in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, he suggested that Christianity and Islam were as valid as Judaism. Such was the storm of criticism that this sparked from fervently Orthodox rabbis in Britain and Israel, that when the second edition of the book emerged in 2004, he had modified the offending statements to be less robust in their recognition of pluralism. One could hardly have a more clear or topical demonstration of the relevance of the question that is the title of my lecture: is religion a source of peace or unrest in society? Sometimes, when religion is accused of causing division, its defenders can argue that the contentious question is political rather than religious. I can say that from the Irish position, perhaps particularly. But in this case, it was clearly a religious conflict within the same religious community about its relations with other religious communities and the nature of religious adherence itself. That these religious divisions are a challenge that must be addressed is clearly stated by Pope Francis, not just in his words, but in his actions. He chose the name Francis in a clear reference to St. Francis of Assisi. And in his papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he points out that St. Francis, at the time of the Crusades, went to visit the Sultan, Malik el-Kamel, in Egypt, a visit which entailed considerable hardship, not least given France's poverty, scarce resources, the great distances to be travelled, and their differences of language, culture, and religion. He takes this action as a precedent, not only for the ecumenical engagement that he had, for example with Bartholomew, the Orthodox Patriarch, but with the interfaith dialogue he undertook with the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Taib in Abu Dhabi, where together they declared that God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. Pope Francis maintained that this joint statement was no mere diplomatic gesture, but a reflection born of dialogue and common commitment, a demonstration that for him, religion has an imperative to seek peace and pursue it, as the psalmist says. For those who value what they would describe as religious beliefs, there are usually at least two fundamental assumptions. The first is that there is such a thing as religion, and secondly, that it is, at least on balance, a good thing. Non-believers often ascribe much more malign consequences from the espousal of what they would call religious beliefs, dismissing them as mere superstition, but often a device whose effect, and perhaps even its intention, is to keep gullible people under control in the interests of the powerful. Other colleagues, including some who have spent their whole lives studying the phenomena of ritual and religiosity, are doubtful that it is possible to construct a definition that encompasses all that we would usually describe as religion, and conclude that there is an arbitrariness in designating something as religious. So perhaps there is a problem with our notion of religion itself, particularly as what we tend to think of as religiosity seems to be something that some people have and others do not, rather than something that is an essential element in being human. For much of history, and what came before, most communities did not think of religion as a separate entity. What we call religion was simply their way of understanding and relating with each other as community and with the universe in which they found themselves. It included ideas about how they and their community had come to be, what was ultimately important in life, and how they understood their obligations to their fellows, not only the world, but the universe in which they found themselves, however they understood that, which of course was very different from how we understand it. These understandings were not always doctrinal statements in the way that we might understand them. They were felt appreciations of life. Often, they involved descriptions of another form of living after death, and an appreciation of life that transcended day-to-day human experience, to which the word God or its equivalent is usually attached. These elements were not inevitably present, but they inform and are often the key factor in the identification of religiosity, especially by secularists. However, this excludes people who have similar religious experiences and would call themselves religious, but do not, for example, believe in life after death, as was the case with some Jews, or a transcendent God in the traditional sense, as the case with many Buddhists. In the course of living their lives, people have experiences which seem to convey a sense of meaning, conviction, and significance to them. In this way, for example, sexual engagement and excitation give a depth to human relationships and help bind people together. Similarly, we feel a sense of awe when we look up at the high mountains, are both exhilarated and terrified by the power of a lightning storm, and gaze in wonderment into a night sky peppered with innumerable heavenly bodies, whose light reaching us departed its sources longer ago than we can even comprehend. Such experiences make people feel that they have encountered something that takes them beyond the ordinariness of life. And there's often a wish to hold on to those feelings so that they may repeat the actions they think enabled them to have that special experience. They want to remember it, to repeat it, and to understand what it meant. In chapter 9 of Mark's Gospel, we're told that the disciples had a special experience on a mountain, probably Mount Tabor, which became known as the Mount of Transfiguration. And they wanted to build shelters, reminders of what had happened. And as they left the place, they debated amongst themselves what had been the meaning or the significance of what they'd seen. This was, of course, a very special and unusual experience, but in everyday life, too, ordinary people engage with each other and with their surroundings and are moved by them, and want to develop a set of understandings that help them to navigate their conduct of life. We are meaning-seeking creatures. For most of history, the idea that the way they understood and experienced life should somehow be isolated and separated off from every other aspect of life and understanding in studies would have seemed very strange indeed to most people. Their way of being in the world was something total, and was, in addition, not a private matter, but something that they shared with the rest of the community. Living together in community is about relationships, not just what I think about someone else, but how I feel about them, how we engage with each other, what we do together. Those activities that ensure that people and their children have food, water, shelter, and security are more successful when understood in some frame of reference that is shared with others. But these understandings are not static things. As time passes, some ways of doing and being are more successful than others. Some ways of understanding what is going on are more persuasive, not only because they seem to make sense of a confusing, unpredictable, and uncertain world, but also they have accorded with felt experience and helped to structure the social group in such a way as to provide some sense of security. Over history, a way of relating emerged in different communities, a way of relating with oneself and others in the group, and with the heavens and the earth, of which one feels a part, though a very small part indeed. When and how did it all begin? Or how would it end? How do I understand such remarkable things as the appearance of new life and the ending of the life of those one loves and even of oneself? These, the most remarkable and important matters of all, birth, life, and death, are all matters of relationships. We are born as the result of a relationship, short or long. We live, but not to ourselves alone. And when we die, it affects those with whom we have lived. We also relate with the rest of creation. Some time ago, I was talking with the chief of a North American indigenous nation, and he was complaining to me about the local environmentalists. I was angry with them, he said, because they were stopping us hunting. And I asked them why they were stopping us doing something that my people had done for hundreds of years. The environmentalist said he was trying to protect the environment. I told him I was part of the environment and he wasn't protecting me. The chief was saying something quite profound about his entirely different perspective, that humanity was a part of nature and the natural order, not a separate phenomenon. The Irish theologian J. Ernest Davey defined religion as the most ultimate, the most real, and the most compelling form in which we conceive the social or universe relationships and obligations of our lives. And in the case of those who may be called non-religious, it is only necessary to invert the form of the sentence. The most ultimate, real, and compelling form in which they conceive their social or universe relationships and obligations is their true religion. In other words, from the time when human beings developed the capacity of conscious reflection on their condition, they engaged in a conscious relationship with the rest of creation. But this way of being in the world was not just cognitive, it was experiential, and it was shared and communal, not just my individual experience. This defines religion and religious experience in a different way. It is not merely a set of beliefs that may or may not influence how you conduct your life, or a series of rituals that you perform representing the culture of your community, or the hope that through such practices you can manipulate some unseen powers that be. Religion is how you engage harmoniously with yourself, your community, and the universe, which you know to possess a complexity beyond what you can understand or command. In that sense, religion is profoundly a way of living at peace with the world. By constructing or adopting from respected others a worldview or perspective, it is possible to make some sense of what happens and how to live. This also contributes to relationships with fellow human beings and the rest of creation. A common way of living emerges in your community with agreed boundaries on behavior. Having some sense of how the world came about, how it continues and will perhaps end, gives a degree of understanding about things that, in truth, it is not possible to be entirely certain about. So, in as far as religion is what J. Ernest Davey described as the most ultimate, the most real, and the most compelling form in which we conceive the social or universe relationships and obligations of our lives, Religion is a word to describe something felt as profoundly meaningful and that directs us to how we live life and is shared, to some degree at least, with those with whom we have close social relationships. In this sense, then, religion is the bringer of peace, enabling human beings who live together to be calm in the face of the profound uncertainties of life and to share deeply, physically, emotionally, and spiritually with others. All of life is shared to some degree, but since, as René Girard has shown, we are imitative creatures, whose imitation of each other leads to conflict as we imitate each other's desires, wanting the same thing, and sometimes the same person. So we need to set down boundaries, rules, and shared understandings that enable us to live in relative peace with each other. These boundaries, rules, and shared understandings emerge from experience and are handed on to the next generation, where they may be modified in the light of different experiences, or they may be endowed with increasing power with the passage of time. So while the experiences of birth, love, survival, and death are shared by all humanity, the explanations given to those experiences and the ways that each individual and community have learned are useful, moving, and motivating to them in their situation and time in history will not necessarily be the same as those of another community. These laws, beliefs, rituals, and stories are not themselves religion, but the epiphenomena of religion. In the same way that life is demonstrated or evidenced in the functions and operations of our bodies and those of other animals and plants, but those functions are not life itself. So when some thinkers question whether there is really such a thing as religion, it seems to me that they are mistaking the infinite variety of the epiphenomena of religion for the common reality of religion itself, which is the fact that we all relate meaningfully with the rest of creation. The phenomena that communities have developed to express or live out their universe or social relationships and obligations have an almost infinite variety of explanations, rituals, social conventions, and cultural expressions. So it's impossible to produce inclusive definitions based on the observed epiphenomena. To observe that many societies do not have a word for religion should not imply that religion does not exist for them, but rather that it is for them all of life's experience. Conflict then arises when one way of living and understanding confronts another which expresses itself differently and incompatibly. There is then no agreement on what is a good way to experience life. In small communities, such differences about how life is to be conducted were either maintained by the community as a whole by excluding any offender, or by the most powerful person in the community making the decision about what was the good and imposing his will. I find this in talking with First Nation leaders in the Yukon, when they told me how their law would conclude that a serious offender should be driven out of the community. In that region, in the past, this would likely have meant death alone in the freezing cold. Now it meant that the offender would just be exported to offend in another community. And in any case, it would be contrary to the human rights provisions of Canadian federal law. What had worked as a lawful sanction in the past was no longer possible, but this was a source of difficulty between the First Nation people and the mainstream of Canadian society. The alternative to such scapegoating of an individual was for those who wished to differ to depart and form another community or engage in a conflict that would threaten the integrity of the group. These mechanisms are seen with some clarity in the history of Christendom. In the first few centuries, different ideas developed in different communities about the meaning of the message of Jesus. He himself had an unusual perspective. We are told in Mark chapter 9, verse 40, that he rebuked his disciples who had wanted to define the boundaries of their group using his authority. And he said, "Whoever is not against us is for us. If the person was doing a good thing, that was what was important. The same attitude was manifest in his interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus had no problem asking her for a drink, and she was surprised because of the socio-cultural boundaries that history had erected between their two peoples. She presses him further, and it became clear that he was not just sitting lightly to these cultural boundaries because he was a bit thirsty, but because he had a different perspective. When she introduced the notion of conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans about where they should worship, on the mountain where they were or in Jerusalem, Jesus talks in terms of worshipping in spirit and in truth rather than in any specific place, and goes on to speak in metaphorical terms about the water of eternal life. The story makes it clear that even though she has had a powerful and moving religious experience and appreciates that something really important is happening that transcends what she had known until now, she still does not understand what he's talking about, and says, "Sir, give me this water so that I never may be thirsty again or have to come here to draw water." These two principles, that the spirit is not bound by either social boundaries or physical boundaries, is central to the message of Jesus. But right from the start, it is misunderstood or ignored. There continues, for example, to be a struggle between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians about what rituals should be performed, what explanations should be believed, and where authority to decide these things should lie. There were arguments among bishops, elders, or presbyters in various councils, and eventually the Emperor Constantine, impatient with all these disagreements, convokes the First Council of Nicaea in 325 and insists on an authoritative statement that creates a boundary between what is acceptable in belief and behavior and what is not. He'd been a military man who had come to power through the army, and he'd been a pagan for most of his life. So it's not surprising that he took a robust authoritarian line. It's doubtful that he gave very deep consideration to the complexity of Jesus' extraordinary message. But what he succeeded in doing was implementing a common way for people to engage with the world, a common religion which came into conflict mostly at its borders with those who had developed a different way of engaging with life and the universe. The Crusades were an expression of that conflict at the borders. But as time passed, the differences emerging within led to splits. First between East and West Christendom, and then with the wars of religion in Europe, and between those states which espoused the traditional Roman faith, and those Protestants which had developed a different approach that they believed to be truer to their own experience and understanding of Jesus' message. After the wars were brought to some kind of closure with the treaties of Westphalia, it would be the rulers of each individual state who would decide on the religion of their subjects. However, this could never hold. Once it was accepted that there was no final external authority and that each person had the right and responsibility to engage themselves with the ultimate questions, religion was no longer a way of living peacefully with oneself and with others, but a constant struggle over what represented the good in life. The Enlightenment then changed the rules. Religion was no longer the whole way that I live life and think about it, but rather a personal set of perspectives and behaviors limited to the private sphere. The most severe form of this view is found in the principle of laïcité in French political culture. It's not the king, then, who has the divine right to determine what I believe, but the community under the primacy of reason, or, more truly, rationalism, and the requirement for this to be enforced by the rule of law. In principle, you could believe what you wished, but your behavior had to accommodate to group norms. This was a very different situation from those societies or communities where there is no need to have a special word for religion since there's nothing in life that falls outside its purview. There is no secular in such a community because all of life is infused with a shared appreciation of the sacredness of all creation. The solution of privatizing issues of purpose, meaning, and ultimate questions created religion as a separate domain. No longer was it possible to maintain the religious perspective of life where everything was brought together and infused with the same values and meaning. Secularism pushed such value perspectives to the margins and made everything a matter of pragmatism. And religious people and institutions withdrew from the public space in many places, except insofar as it intruded upon a limited range of specific social and moral stances that had been derived from earlier, mostly pre-scientific times, communities, and experiences. As I previously said elsewhere, perhaps the most important contribution of Pope St. John Paul II was his insistence that faith drove him to address questions of politics and science as well as faith. When he was elected in October 1978, he became the first non-Italian pope since the 16th century, which was when Christendom had split again. And the Roman Church had focused since then largely on maintaining as much of its place in people as possible, and to some extent turned in upon itself. Pope John Paul II engaged in a process of looking outwards. He became not only the most travelled pontiff, but one of the most travelled world leaders in history. And in the personal encouragement he gave to the formation of the Solidarity Union, he was not only key to the ending of communist rule in his native Poland, but eventually in all of Europe, and indeed to the collapse of the whole Soviet system. He also led the Roman Church in addressing its relationship with science, regarding the work of scientists as their contribution to the search for truth and a twin sister of the search of faith. This was a priority for him all through his papacy. He gave real support to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences here in Rome, an independent body within the Holy See, whose first leader had been Galileo Galilei. Pope John Paul took an active interest in the Academy, updating its statutes and increasing the number of academicians. In 1979, in a speech at the Academy on the centenary of the birth of Albert Einstein, he requested the establishment of a committee of historians, theologians, and scientists to examine again the case of Galileo and to remove the distrust that this episode still generated and any obstacles that it created in the way of fruitful concord between science and faith. The committee reported in 1992, when Pope John Paul II made clear that the Church's ruling had been in error and that Catholics were not hostile to science. These actions helped to draw the Roman Church back into the broader conversation of religion as an approach to the whole of life, rather than as a walled-off private space. In the first place, thinking about religion, especially in the West, had focused very much on what people believed and on the observance of rituals and behaviors and how they were explained. The Reformation had raised fundamental questions about the importance of religious practices and works. Rituals and requirements were regarded as too susceptible to corruption, and they focused instead, the Reformers, on the centrality of grace. Grace was the unmerited favor of God that was not a result of works, not even religious works. But it was a result of faith that they believed to be proclaimed in the Bible. Sola gratia, sola fide, and sola scriptura. However, this attempt to address the problem was not ultimately successful. Firstly, if religion had earlier been about people finding a way to live at peace with themselves, their fellows, and the world, the different perspectives enforced by different authorities now produced conflict initially between different countries, whose rulers adopted different perspectives, and then between communities of those who shared beliefs as over against those who differed. The principle that whoever is not against us is for us was based on what people did. They were healing people, an obvious good. However, it was not so obvious. The disciples had come from a background where even doing something good might be made less than good if it was done on the wrong day, or by the wrong person, or in the wrong way. In addition, after the invention of printing, what we nowadays would call a disruptive technology, and as people began to read, the previous interpretations of the authorities no longer seemed believable. While more conservative theologians engaged in ever more complicated explanations to obviate the seeming contradictions or inadequacies of older beliefs, more progressive theologians find it increasingly difficult to match the new findings of science with the biblical accounts of the life of Christ. They decided that the problem was that the account of his life had been corrupted by generations of retelling the story with an increasing supernatural overlay. They thought that to really understand Jesus, they needed to peel back those layers, scrape away the accretions of history, and demythologize the stories to reveal the real Jesus. We could then all come to agree on this real Jesus and what he said and meant. They believed that myths were stories about things that never really happened, and so to find the true historical Jesus, the mythical elements needed to be removed. However, myths are not stories about things that did not happen. On the contrary, they are symbolic stories about things that happen all the time. And they have the potential to give us profound insights into ever-relevant, real-life human dilemmas. Demythologizing the stories simply empties them of much of their meaning. They need to be understood neither as inaccurate history nor as primitive science, but as something more like poetry that conveys true messages about the human condition. This is true in the Abrahamic faiths, the Dharmic religions, and all the other wisdom traditions. If it was not the case that they conveyed some real truths that people felt were valuable, they would fade away. One reason why humanity developed this highly symbolic way of speaking and behaving was that we necessarily have a very limited and modest capacity for understanding and relating with the universe. The more we learn about it, the more we appreciate that our understanding is restricted to a narrow bandwidth that does not, for example, include the very small subatomic world or the very large intergalactic multiverse. Just as the bandwidth of our sight or hearing is also limited to those things that our senses can perceive. Bats can communicate and find their way around in the dark by emitting sonar frequencies outside the range of our human hearing. With a suitable electronic device, this can be detected. But without the device, human beings are as deaf to the sounds as bats who could not see in the dark. This is not just true of what we can and cannot hear or see. There will always be things that are outside the bandwidth of our human capacities, especially when we are considering meaning and purpose. Since this is so, the only way that we can think about, talk about, and engage with such matters is in a symbolic way. We tell stories that convey some element or aspect of the mysterious reality that transcends our capacities. No single story conveys or explicates it all. So a library of books of stories is required, some of which seem to conflict with or contradict each other. We call it the Bible. This is all because there is a complexity about reality and about what is the good. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin had a good deal to say about this problem. The notion of the perfect whole, he said, the ultimate solution in which all good things coexist, seems to me to be not merely unattainable, that is a truism, but conceptually incoherent. I do not know what is meant by a harmony of this kind. Some among the great goods cannot live together. That is a conceptual truth. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss. Happy are those who live under a discipline which they accept without question, who freely obey the orders of leaders, spiritual or temporal, whose word is fully accepted as unbreakable law, or those who have by their own methods arrived at a clear and unshakable conviction about what to do, and that brooks no possible doubt. I can only say that those who rest on such comfortable beds of dogma are victims of forms of self-induced myopia, blinkers that they may make for contentment, but not for understanding the complexity of what it is to be human, there are inevitable contradictions. In another place he said, what is good for the fox is not good for the rabbit. Unless the fox becomes a vegetarian, which is not really what foxes are about. In other words, it is not religion that leads to conflicts, but the fact that whether or not we believe in what are the great religions, we will inevitably have differences of perspective because choice is inevitable in life. And we will all have made different choices and come to different places in our thoughts and lives, given our different backgrounds, cultures, and experiences. Indeed, more than that, when he refers to, quotes, those who live under a discipline which they accept without question, he is speaking of those who espouse a system of thought that is not their own, but taken on authority. In other words, it is not religion as traditionally understood that leads to conflict, but the breakdown of religious authority, but that is inevitable where there is the opportunity of choice. Thinking is only one aspect of our engagement or relationship with others and the wider universe in which we live. We have also developed ways of behaving which assist relationships. These ethical boundaries enable us to relate with other human beings, and we have rituals that help us to express our relations with the wider creation too. If we have no boundaries to our behavior, we will quickly run into difficulties with others with whom we live, and indeed with nature more generally. While different boundaries for behavior have developed in different societies at various times, all societies have found the need to establish some set of boundaries. To dismiss these as arbitrary or foolish is to fail to understand the fundamental necessity for boundaries if we are to guard us from ourselves and to protect all of us from foolish or destructive aspects of each other. Some of the boundaries will change from time to time as social or cultural mores change. But the need for some boundaries does not diminish if society is to function. There are also some boundaries for behavior that are more universal. Thou shalt do no murder, or steal, or lie, are relatively universal and can justifiably be regarded as human values. Whether or not to commit oneself to one person of the same sex or of a different sex changes. The great Jewish patriarchs had a number of wives and concubines. And nowadays, that's not generally regarded as appropriate in most Western countries. But now, in some countries, same-sex relationships are entirely acceptable, and not in others and at other times. These issues would seem to be social or cultural norms, but not as fundamental human moral values of the same kind as do no murder, steal, or lie. Many people would, however, insist that forced sexual intercourse is morally unacceptable, whether with someone of the same sex or a different sex. So it's something of a different order. It is a more fundamental human moral value. However, we not only engage or relate through how we think and in the ways that we behave, but also in how we feel. When we look up at the majesty of nature and we feel a sense of awe, we may try to convey that sense in words, in painting, in music, but we will experience it in how we feel. This is the kind of transcendent experience to which we may or may not apply the word religious, depending mostly on whether we think in such a way. But however we differ in our description of it, whether we understand and speak about the mountains in scientific, artistic, or religious terms, we will be conveying an experience of the mountains that is common to us all as human beings. And without such experiences, our lives would be thin and feeble indeed. I've been referring to how we manage to construct our lives, not only as individuals, but also in community. The human baby will not live for any length of time without some more or less caring relationships. And throughout our lives, social relatedness is a hugely significant driver. Religion is about how we think, behave, and feel about our human existence, not only as individuals, but as communities. And those practices that we describe as religious must always involve someone else, whether in the here and now presence of another person or a transcendent experience of relatedness that goes beyond. While the anthropological observation of religion has tended to focus mainly on observing external actions, rites, conventions, and modes of behavior, the study of religious beliefs, creeds and doctrines, and the description of religious structures, churches, mosques, temples, the authority of religious leaders. These are the issues on which we tend to differ from religion to religion, from place to place, and also from time to time within religious communities. There are, however, other elements which are common to us as human beings, especially what we call religious experience. The need for ethical boundaries as distinct from the adoption of particular boundaries, and the requirement for shared practices that enable us to relate to each other. When I was dealing with the violent conflict in Ireland, some of those who were involved in politics were keen to focus on the differences in the ways our communities thought, behaved, and related. While these were often described as religious differences, they were more accurately understood as differences of identity and allegiance. The differences were real and resulted in disturbed relationships between Protestants, most of whom identified and felt allegiance with Scotland or England, and Catholics, for whom the rest of the island of Ireland represented their vital relationship. These were competing conceptions of the good, and no solution could be found by seeking the victory of one perspective and the defeat of the other, or indeed of both. What was necessary was to accept that there was a plurality of perspectives and to seek commonality of needs. This was also the approach of the recently deceased Nobel Prize winner John Hume, the leader of constitutional nationalism in the North, and winner with the Unionist leader David Trimble of the 1998 Nobel Prize for Peace. John often spoke about working together on common social and economic challenges, spilling our sweat instead of our blood, he often called it. The outcome of this approach was the pluralist political settlement of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Even the name represented two differing perspectives, Belfast, Good Friday. This kind of pluralism is neither multiculturalism nor relativism. It is a recognition of different ways of engaging or relating with the world. Protestants and Catholics have different ways of thinking about problems and how to deal with them, and both needed to be given respect. What then is the answer to the question in the title of the lecture? Is religion a source of peace or unrest in society? From the line of thinking I've been trying to follow, the answer I would give is that religion is an attempt to bring peace within us, between us, and with the universe we live in, and the great world religions have been an attempt to enable people to subsume their individual differences in a shared appreciation of the complexity of our experience. Our determination to have choice leads inevitably to profound differences of perspective and culture, and therefore to the potential for conflict, as we fear that if our culture, our way of being in the world as a community does not survive, that which is essential to us as individuals and communities will be destroyed, and that we will, in that profoundly human sense, die. It seems likely that only religious pluralism can accommodate the fundamental religious purpose of bringing peace. Which brings me back to the comments I referred to at the start of this lecture, the ones that got Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks into such trouble with his own Orthodox colleagues. The ecumenical movement tried to achieve peace within much of Christendom without notable success. But perhaps this was due to a focus on the external phenomena, beliefs, rituals, and religious structures, the things on which we differ. If interfaith dialogue addresses the same issues, it is likely to have the same outcome. If, however, it can explore the fundamental nature and purpose of religion, and do so in a pluralist mode, religion may be able to achieve its primary purpose of bringing peace on the other side of conflict. What then is the role in society of those of us who appreciate the central significance of these elements of life and living to which we apply the term religious. It is perhaps to explore an understanding of how the obligations of our lives and the meaning of the universe we inhabit can only be appreciated in symbols and stories, to be modest about our current understandings, to be committed to follow where the Spirit leads as we evolve and develop individually and community, to be appreciative of the richness of experience we can enjoy, and especially to take seriously how we need to conduct ourselves in relation with others and with our world, doing justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with our God.
Thank you very much, John, for your profound reflection on the, say, generally speaking, relation between religion and politics in a context of nowadays world. And I would like to invite you to the discussion on that lecture. We have a time for Q&A session. Sister Helen, please. Would you be so kind and come here? Yes, then we can. Yes, that way, unfortunately.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I would like to bring another dimension into it, because one of the things I think today, with the kinds of problems we have to face, which I think mostly we can see, the big ones, when we open the newspapers and look at what the things people are talking about, are either the ecological ones, the environmental ones, or they're social, to do with exclusion, discrimination, inequality, these kinds of topics. They are ones that require a kind of transversal, systemic, and social approach. And I think this means that the way that we've tried to deal with peace in the West in the last, 400 years, as you were saying, by putting the religion into the private sphere, which has had a lot of benefits in many ways. I mean, it doesn't allow us really to confront these problems where we have to look at shared goals. Having a good environment is something that we have to somehow work towards together. And social exclusion and discrimination, something we can resolve only as a community. And I think, to me, that brings us into kind of new ground in the West. And what you were talking about, that we need to bring the religions together in a strongly plural sense, but still really the religions as they are, I think is a really important part of it, because for many people, religion is closely connected with how they understand the final goals of their life, the good life. And 84% of the world's population, as you know, according to Pew Research Trust, says that people have religion. So it's a really, I think it's important for peace, but it's also important for us to resolve our problems, that somehow we have to bring this shared religious understanding about what's good into a shared debate. And I can understand if people might be quite scared about that, because it's quite different from what we're used to. But I think it's our challenge, one of our challenges for our day, just like 400 years ago, so they had to deal with a different set of challenges. I'm interested in what you think about that. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. And I'd even go further than that and say that there is an extraordinary opportunity at present. I will be going back to the UK in a week or so's time, and we'll be going up to COP26. And talking over the last number of months with colleagues, many of whom would be at best skeptical about religions of any kind, a number of them have started to say to me, you know, we need to be working together with the people of faith, because most religious communities have some sense of the stewardship, the common stewardship of the world, of our environment. And furthermore, they are able to inspire their people to make sacrifices for the things they believe in. Whereas often those that come from a less obviously religious background have instilled in people the idea that they shouldn't be making sacrifices, they should be fulfilling themselves. So the first thing is, I think, that many people trying to address these questions that you describe are beginning to realize that there are things about the religious attitude to life with which they may need to engage if they're going to be successful in the things that they want to achieve, which are things that many of us want to achieve as well. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that many of those who have turned away from what you might call traditional religion have not left behind entirely any kind of spiritual dimension to their lives. And they've turned to all sorts of things, New Age religions, some have even gone back to Druidism, I mean, all sorts of stuff. What that says to me is they appreciate that there is something about spirituality, which they may not easily put into words. They do not like to use the word religion because of the resonances it has. And one of the things that Ernest Davey, who I quoted, speaks about in one of his other books is, and this was back in the early part of the 20th century, he was bemoaning the fact that our language and behavior, he said, is putting off the next generation. They are putting off thinking and talking about God because God means something to them from a language that we use rather than from a reality which is beyond any of our language. And that doesn't mean you stop using the language you're comfortable with. But it may well mean that you acknowledge more fervently that it is simply human language which at some times may need to be transcended to engage with the reality which is beyond all of that. So I think that's the second thing, that there is not just an appetite, there's a hunger, I think, out there for meaning and that which transcends and goes beyond the day-to-day ordinary experience. And I think the third thing came out about 5 years ago in a conference which I was running for Shia Muslims and Christians. We had some Shia Muslims who came from Iran to engage with us in Oxford. And one of my colleagues, who had been a principal of a theological college in Ireland, said, actually, postmodernism gives us an entree because it accepts that everybody can have their own perspective on things. So no one can turn around and say, I'm ruling that religious stuff out of order, because you hang on a second, why are you ruling that particular thing out of order when you're saying anything else is okay? So I think you're absolutely right to point out that there are tremendous opportunities. They are, however, opportunities that could be destroyed by religious people if they want to build a boundary around themselves and protect themselves from these other people. And I think one of the things that John Paul II did, as I said in the lecture, was that he changed a historic defensive posture into a posture that went out. It engaged with science. He engaged with other religions. He traveled around the world in a most remarkable way. And he changed that posture from a defensive posture to an engaged posture, an evangelical posture in that kind of sense. So I think you're absolutely right to point that up. There's a tremendous opportunity. And I really desperately hope that we don't miss it because we're too frightened. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mine is just a very simple question on the issue of peace and religion. What would be the best way to address a person from the other religion who understands only the language of violence. And every attempt to create this atmosphere of discussion and dialogue towards peaceful coexistence inspires in him all the more greater violence. I'm from Nigeria, and maybe some of us might have heard the concept of Boko Haram, which means an Islamic terrorist group, which means senza istruzione, without no book, Boko Haram. And these people had been brainwashed by maybe their leaders, so-called maybe imam or whatever. And then the only thing they understand is kill, kill, just kill. In this way, okay, they don't even understand like any attempt at all. So how do you address such a soul? And when you make such attempts, you hear in one or two other villages that they had attacked and then perforated the womb of pregnant women, raped ladies, shot these people. This is the horrible situation. And when the people from this village that they had attacked make some reprisal attacks on them, then there is certain degree of peace. Maybe not real peace. So what the best way to address this question of peace when the person you want to engage with is totally out for violence and death? Thank you.
I always get very nervous when somebody says, I have a very simple question. Because it's usually an extremely complex question, actually, but it can be put simply and clearly, and that, of course, is exactly what you've done. And indeed, there is a great deal of nervousness, even over the last few days, about what's been developing in Nigeria. It's very troubling. The first thing that I would say is this. The problem that you are describing is an individual problem insofar as if you or your sister or your wife or your friend is killed, they are an individual human being, and you are an individual human being. But the dynamic that you're dealing with is not a dynamic of individuals being against individuals. Because most of the people that Boko Haram are killing are not people that they even know. They don't know anything about them. They don't even necessarily know what religion they are. They may have a degree of confidence because they happen to live in a village that's called Christian. But they really don't necessarily know. Just in the same kind of way as when Al-Qaeda brought down the Twin Towers, many of the people that were brought down were Muslims. Many of them were people who disagreed with the posture of the United States government, which was part of what was generating the attacks by Al-Qaeda. So these are large group phenomena. They're not phenomena that emerge because of individual antipathies. So when you're trying to deal with them, you have to deal with the large group phenomenon. In the Northern Ireland situation, for example, when people were being killed, people were being blown up, shot, and so on, no amount of bringing individual Protestants and Catholics away to make friends with each other sorted it out. Thousands and thousands of young children, Protestants and Catholics, were taken to America and the Netherlands and so on. They had a wonderful time together. They came back and started throwing stones at each other again. So that individual sets of relationships didn't solve anything at all. The only way it began to be addressed in our situation was when the whole community at the level of their representatives started to engage with each other and to deal with three questions. Anywhere I've gone in the world, I've always found three phenomena where there has been intractable violence. The first is that at least one group of people, and often more than one, feels that they are humiliated and disrespected. And that's unbelievably toxic. You and I can have a conversation here, we can disagree about all sorts of things, but if I respond to you in a way that humiliates and disrespects you, that will be really toxic, and you might remember nothing else of what I say, but if you bumped into me in 20 years' time, should I still be around then, you will remember how I made you feel and how it was bad. Humiliation and disrespect is profoundly toxic. The second thing I've always found is a profound sense of unfairness. I don't say injustice, that's far too legalistic. You know, when one of my kids would come to me about something one of the others had done, they would say, "It's not fair, Daddy. It's not fair." It's felt in here. It's not something they think out. So again, it's passionate feelings. And the third thing is that peaceful democratic means have not been able to be used to resolve whatever the problems were that led to the humiliation and the sense of unfairness. Now, whether we like it or not, the relationship between Christendom and the Muslim world over the last 2 millennia, near enough, has been terrible. It's been dreadful. It's not going to be resolved in a few weeks or a few months or one country. It's a huge task. And when the President of the United States comes out and uses a word like crusade, he may be thinking about Billy Graham for all I know, but it doesn't mean that to Muslims. And it doesn't get forgotten about easily either. And that one of the enormous problems for us is that the way that we have engaged with other parts of the world leaves a long tail of pain that we may forget, but they remember. For example, in our dealings with China, I had to do some negotiations with Beijing over something a few years ago. And I was really puzzled by the engagement until I realized that as far as they were concerned in their engagement with me coming from the United Kingdom, the most important thing was what they called the Century of Humiliation. I might think about Hong Kong and think about business and money and freedom of expression and democracy and all these kinds of things. They thought about the Opium Wars and why we had Hong Kong in the first place. And I find this in all the kinds of engagements I've had. So what you're having to deal with is the outcome of generations of humiliation, disrespect, hatred, unfairness, all these sorts of things that weren't necessarily done by you or your people or even your country or your part of the world, but you suffer for it. You know what it's like when somebody has a bad day at the office and they come home and they kick the dog. The dog didn't have anything to do with it at all. But the feelings that were there came out on whatever was there, the door, the person that they were having coffee, whatever. And you're finding yourself and your whole community is suffering from things that happened historically and often in other parts of the world. So the only way that we can deal with this is slowly and painfully to start engaging with each other in a way that says, look, I disagree profoundly with you, but I'm not going to treat you with disrespect. I'm not going to try to be unfair. I'm going to try to be different from that. Now, it's with the particular groups of people that you're speaking about, it's almost impossible to do that at this point. Almost impossible. So the kind of work that has been done by Christian leaders like the Holy Father, going out and meeting with Muslim leaders and putting that out as press statements and repeating it over and over again and encouraging people in places which are less racked by violence with people who have more capacity to engage with each other begins to create a process that over the next 2, 3, 4 generations can lead us to a place where people no longer feel this frenzied hatred and sense of the wish to destroy. Now, I wish I could tell you there was some magic way of sorting it out. But you wouldn't believe me because you would know it was nonsense. This is a difficult, painful struggle. And we need to work with you, and we need to work with other people in other parts of the world to try to get beyond the situation we're in. At the moment, it's all going the opposite way. Deepening of fundamentalism, deepening of nationalisms of various kinds, polarization, political fragmentations, everything's blowing apart. People are frightened by new technology, they're frightened by climate change, they're frightened by war, destruction. We have a huge task to try to pull that back. And that's why the point that you are making is so absolutely vital. Because if we don't do that, there may be no world for our grandchildren. I was at a lecture just as we were moving into lockdown by a very senior theologian. And he was telling a little story, which I suspect came from someone else, but he told it well. And the story was of two planets, and they were passing each other in space. And one planet shouts out to the other one, says, "How are you?" And the other one shouts back, "Not very well." And the other one shouts back, "I'm sorry to hear that. What's wrong?" And the answer came back, "I've got a bad dose of Homo sapiens." "Ah," said the first one, "I'm sorry to hear that, but don't worry, it will soon pass." We have no right to exist. We have a responsibility to the next generation and to the universe that we live in. But we have no right to exist. And what you're flagging up is a red light for all of us as to how we engage with each other as well as with the wider environment. So thank you for doing that.
I'm Father Tomasz Podlewski from Archdiocese of Częstochowa from Poland. Your Lordship, in these days, bishops from my country, from Poland, are here in Rome on Ad Limina Apostolorum visit, and I know that they, in many congregations and dicasteries, talk about relationship between the state and the church. I think it's valuable to make our point of view broader. So, sir, according with your reflections and your beautiful experiences, in your opinion, what is important to make this relationship peaceful, creative, harmonic, not only for believers but for all societies in the future and for the future? Thank you.
Let me ask for a second question. Father Thomas, maybe we put together the questions.
It's a good economy of time. Mine might be a little longer. So I'll try to be brief, and you can, of course, answer his as priority. But yes, I mean, I'm very sympathetic for what you're doing in terms of challenging the let's call it the secular mindset that religion is an eccentricity, and you're rooting religion in a broad anthropological space that effectively makes it almost a universal phenomena. And I'm also, of course, sympathetic to the practical ends you're trying to reach in terms of emphasizing the important goals of constructive interreligious coexistence and pluralistic religious coexistence. However, you said you said two things I think I must disagree with quite deeply, and I'm interested to hear how you respond. You said our beliefs, like rituals, which was the other example you gave, our beliefs are externals. There's something outside of ourselves. And as long as we focus on our beliefs, those are the things that will divide us. Now, I think I must disagree with you on those, because it seems to me, and this is a complementary comment to what Sister Helen was saying, I think our propositional claims about truth are as interior and as important as anything else in us, including many of the fine moral sentiments you manifested, which are your beliefs, which are not universally shared. And so I think a lot of what we're dealing with when we deal with political, social, religious, and moral conflict is about trying to find the truth together, which I don't think is ever easy. But I also don't believe that religious dogmatic beliefs, you mentioned Nicaea, the belief in the Trinity, I don't think a belief like the belief in the Trinity is necessarily just a division. I think it's also a deep point of unity in ecumenical conversation, because even if I might differ with a Protestant about the sacraments or rituals or justification by faith, I have a shared Trinitarian baptism. But even with Muslims, I might have a shared belief in theism and belief in somehow in the dignity of human beings, the special creatures of God or divine providence, and with British secular atheist liberals, I might have a deep shared belief in nonviolent coexistence and principles of justice in civic society. So it seems to me that actually generically shared beliefs are actually really important for our own motivation and also for unity, and that these can coexist with strong dogmatic beliefs if we can make distinctions. I mean, if I, as a, say, Catholic, can distinguish that in virtue of which I have a shared life with Protestant Christians or non-Christian religionists or non-religious secularists, so that I find that level of shared belief to coexist with them, and in the dialogue with them, I'm trying to find that. I don't know if you disagree with me, but the way you said it, that beliefs are external to us and that they divide us, it seemed a strong statement, and I wanted to at least, well, I hope not conflict, but engage in a constructive dialogue with you about that.
Well, first of all, as far as the question of the relationship between church and state is concerned, it seems to me that when people of faith engage with the state in such a way as to use the strength of the state to implement their perspectives, it almost always ends up in tears. Because they then start to impose their wish and their set of beliefs. But on top of that, they begin to derive an authority from the engagement with the state. An authority which comes not from faith, but from military rule, policing, the administration of justice, the economy, and so on and so on and so on. And so it seems, from my perspective, that relationship is a troubled and problematic one. Now, the way that some people thought to resolve this, both from the point of view of the state and of the church, was the separation of church and state. Well, I understand theoretically why they decided to do that, but it didn't really work out terribly well. If you look, for example, at the United States and the United Kingdom, so the United Kingdom has a state church. The Queen is the head of the church as well as the head of state. But my perspective is that the Church of England has hugely less impact on what goes on in terms of decisions about those kinds of things than do evangelical Christians in the United States of America, for example, where there is in principle a separation of church and state. But actually, nobody has any chance of being elected as President of the United States unless they're prepared to present themselves at least as some kind of Christian. In fact, one of the big issues at an earlier stage in the 20th century is whether you could even be President of the United States and be a Catholic. I mean, that was one of the huge issues about Jack Kennedy, for example. Now, people got beyond that. Still haven't got beyond the business of a woman being president, but eventually these things change. But the point is that this notion that we can separate church and state is not a simple thing that can be done structurally. And yet, it does seem to me there is a very real problem in there. Of course, there was a problem which was recognized in Jesus' day. And he was asked the question. And he gave this answer, which we will all continue to puzzle over, which was, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. And of course, the zealots would have said, well, what Caesar's due is a boot in the back, and out he goes. Well, I don't think that's quite what Jesus meant either. But there is an issue there. So there's no easy answer, but you're absolutely right to raise the question. Now, on the question of beliefs and so on, the conversation which I'm trying to create for myself and in engagement with others is to actually look more thoughtfully at many of the things we take for granted. So, for example, you might say that the belief in heaven is obviously something that has been around all through the time of the church and before that. But we believe something completely different about heaven than was believed in those days. Because in those days, people literally did believe that if you went up far enough, you got to heaven. They had a whole view about the pillars and the water above the earth and the water below the earth and all these kinds of, which we do not believe at all now. There are a whole lot of things referred to in the Bible about the seats of our emotions. And that notion changed from Roman times to the Middle Ages to now we have totally different, even when we use exactly the same words to describe what we believe and say, well, these are the words that were used 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, they don't necessarily mean the same things as they meant then. They don't even necessarily mean the same thing to different people in different communities nowadays. So this whole business of exactly what we believe, I went to, there's a particular monastery that I go to from time to time to visit colleagues there and to have a retreat. And there are 40 monks there, around about 40 monks. And I asked the abbot about what approach they had. And he said, well, there's 40 different sets of beliefs here. Because even when people use the same words, they don't necessarily mean the same things or have the same mental models about them. And when you say about Christians all sharing a Trinitarian view, well, actually, there are Unitarians who don't necessarily have that view at all, and it led to all sorts of issues around. And in my own background, the reverberations of some of those disagreements from a couple of centuries ago still rattle around. The truth is that there's a complexity about all of this. And I think what I'm trying to say in it is there are some things that we take as being permanent and unchanging and unchangeable, and they aren't actually so in the way that we think of them. This old fellow was giving off about new translations of the scriptures, and he said, if the authorized version was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Now that's a really rather primitive perspective on it, and it's not one that you share for sure. But I think the point is that the way we think about things changes much more than we imagine,